Hey everyone, hope you're doing well. Today I'll go through a game that I saw on ChessBase India's YouTube video. It's between Denis Kadric against Hikaru Nakamura. And I downloaded this game off the website, but it actually missed a load of moves out. So it was lucky the video existed so I could fill in the end game. But it was actually a really nice game and quite intense at the end when both sides had a couple of seconds left each. So the game began with e4, e5. There was knight to f3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop c5, and now c3. And Hikaru played knight to f6. After d3, both sides castled, and Hikaru hit out with d5, hitting the bishop. So white has to take, and black recaptures with the knight, with now white playing a4. So maybe stopping black from playing a6 and b5, also preparing to play b4 themselves. So for this reason, black plays a5 to stifle that. Rook e1 is played, hitting this e5 pawn, and now bishop g4 pins the knight against the queen, so no longer attacking the e5 pawn. h3 hits the bishop bishop drops back. The knight supports the other knight, and Hikaru plays knight b6, hitting the bishop on c4, and the bishop drops back to b3, and now king h8 is played by black. Now I looked at this as well. This is quite weird because the queen's obviously attacking this pawn in this position. So I had to figure out why Hikaru didn't take this, and I think it's because after queen takes d3 it looks like black just won a pawn. So if for instance now bishop c2, black can just take, bishop takes queen and rook takes, and black's just a free pawn up. But if we go back, white actually has this nice move here, knight to e4, hitting the bishop on c5, has to trade queen, so bishop takes. Black's forced to drop their bishop backwards, but then white has this move, knight takes e5. After knight takes e5, there's bishop takes h5, and white wins the pawn back. Black's actually given us slightly better here after knight to d3, rook to d1, and rook a d8. But it's still equal material, and in a blitz game, anything can happen. So Hikaru played king h8 anyway, and then there was knight to e4, which hits the bishop. Hikaru protects his own bishop, and the knight manoeuvres to g3, hitting black's other bishop. So bishop drops back, white goes to d5, black shores things up with bishop to d6, and white hits out with d4 where there's a trade. This bishop takes c6, doubling black's c-pawns, and now knight takes d4. So possibly now white may be giving us slightly better here, because they're hitting the c6 pawn, and black's structure is a bit damaged. Saying that though, they do have an open b file for one of these rooks to infiltrate, so it's quite double-edged. Knight c5 was played, knight takes c6, so Hikaru's given up a free pawn there for some play, so he plays queen h4, get his queen into the game. There's queen d4, this captures, knight takes, and knight goes to d3, which hits the rook and the bishop. So rook to d1 hits the knight, black takes, doubles white's g-pawns, and now there's c5. So the knight on d3 is protected by the bishop on g6. So now Hikaru hits out with c5, attacks the knight, which drops back, and c4 just sort of cements this knight into a nice position here. Knight to f4 was played though, trying to dislodge the knight, and Hikaru goes for activity, plays rook a to b8. I think it's important to do this, you need to hit this pawn really. But here actually white's missed a good chance to gain an advantage. It's quite tricky to see, to be fair, but b4 is actually a really good move here. It's quite tricky for black to continue, because if let's say knight takes knight here, then just bishop takes and hitting the rook is good for white, because once the rook moves, let's say there, then white can just push the pawn up. Also after b4, c takes b3, you can do en passant if you want, but then just comes knight takes d3. After rook f d8, white can simply just play knight to b2. After trading, luckily this b2 square is covered by two pieces, and white's just a whole piece up. The tricky solution actually after b4 is to play knight takes c1. The rook takes, there's a takes b4, pawn takes, rook takes b4, and now knight d5 is the move that white should play, because once it moves away, there's rook takes c4. And now white has a clear past a pawn. Probably should win this game with good play. So yeah, b4 for white would have been really nice. However, still not bad. Knight takes d3 was played instead. Pawn takes d3 and now b4 was played. Rook f c8 was played, hitting the pawn on c3. It was bishop to d2. Pawn takes b4, pawn takes b4, and now rook to c2. So this looks quite dangerous for black. White's got 2 passed pawns here, and to be honest, yeah, white is winning this position. So a5 was played, good move. Bishop to e4, a6, just going further down the board, and then bishop to a8, just blocking that pawn from promoting. I think the best move here for white would have been to push the pawn even further, just pawn to a7, because it doesn't do any harm, to be honest. And then after rook a6, white's probably got a really nice favourable position. But in the game, white played rook a c1. The rook went to a2, and now this b5 was played. Quite a tricky move. Obviously, if rook takes b5, there's rook to c8 is checkmate. So after b5, Hikaru has to play h6, giving the king a safety square. White plays bishop to f4. Again, you can't really take this because then rook check, king moves, rook takes bishop can be played. So Hikaru played rook to e8 instead. There's rook d2, stopping black from infiltrating on the second rank. Hikaru played rook to a5, didn't want to trade rooks, and now white has the rook behind the b pawn. So Hikaru tries to gain some counterplay, plays g5, hits the bishop, which is actually on a really nice square, so it's good to dislodge it. But now comes bishop to c7, forcing the rook to move once again. And now there's b6, and the pawn gets closer to queening. But this allows black to take on a6, and it forces black to lose the bishop, so black can get out of it. Bishop takes b7, rook takes b7, and now rook to a3. So it's a bit double-edged, but white should win this game, to be honest. Bishop d6, rook to a1, king h2, and then h5. The best move here actually is a winning move here for white, which was bishop to e7. Preparing to play bishop to f6, which will pick up the rook on a1. So the king is forced to move, but now this allows white just to pick up the pawn on d3, and that should be GG really. And there's not really much for black to do. They're going to lose one another pawn most likely. Let's say rook f1, bishop takes g5. So instead of bishop e7, white played rook to e7. Not as good a move. Still should be winning though. So there's a trade. Bishop f6 is threatened again, so Hikaru removes his king. White picks up a free pawn. And now there's rook a3, protecting the d3 pawn. But bishop f4. And to be honest, maybe white shouldn't even move these pieces anymore. Should just leave them on these squares. The bishop can't really be attacked anymore. So Hikaru gets his king up. White decides to get their king into play, which makes a lot of sense. But black's king just gets to e4, which looks quite scary. Rook to d1 was played. I'm not sure about this move. I feel like maybe white should just keep it on that square. Rook a2 check was played, bishop to d2, and now f5. There was king f1, king d4. And bear in mind, both sides now have a couple of seconds. We do get increment, but it's quite a stressful time. So obviously don't be able to think a lot. Bishop goes back to f4, rook goes to c2, then rook d2. There's a check thrown in, king f2, and rook to b1. King to f3, rook goes to h1. A check is thrown in, and we get this position, rook f2. Rook goes back to f1, a1, sorry, and the king comes into f4. And I think from this position, white should win the game. Hikaru has played it very well, though. It's made it quite double-edged, and it's quite difficult to win. He played rook a8. So bishop d2, check was played. The king went to c2, and then the king went to g5. And here I think black makes a mistake. There was king to d1, and here white should just win the game here with bishop to f4. It cuts the king off from defence of this d3 pawn. Rook to d2 is the threat, and we'll pick up the d3 pawn. So after king e1, let's say, and rook d2, black probably has to defend with something like rook a3, and then, to be honest, white's just free to pick up these pawns and promote. So probably should have gone for that. Instead he took the pawn h5. Hikaru played rook to a2, and this is the problem. King takes h5 is a blunder, and now it's just a draw. Because after rook a2, white's losing material. So white has to bail out with rook takes f5. So the bishop's attacked twice, and it's pinned. A move like bishop to e3 maybe be able to be played, but then just comes takes, I guess. Bishop takes, king there. The bishop has to move, and yeah, black's just going to queen his pawn and should win the game. So after rook a2, this rook takes f5, and here you see on the video, I'll post the video in the description, but Hikaru's face lights up, and I think he realises now it's a drawn position. There's rook takes d2, so rook d5, the king moves, and then g4. Important for black to take this pawn on g2. But after several more moves, this is pretty much a draw now. Rook g3. And in the game, white just took on d2 with check, and it was a draw. If white tries to go for a win, you can play h4, but then just comes rook d3. And after several more moves like check, king to b3, another check, king c4, rook b1, gets a queen, takes, king h6. It looks as though maybe white's going to get a queen. But luckily black's just in time after king d4, g7 for instance, rook g1, king h7, and they have this nice little tactic, rook h1. They get a queen, they can check, king g7, and yeah, this is just a complete draw. So in the game, white takes on d2 with check, king takes. Again, I was thinking maybe h4 here, maybe white can go for a win, but black's just in enough time. King e3, king h6, and after king f4, let's say h5, king f5. White could even lose this if a move like king h7 here, king f6 just wins, because he can't push this g pawn. So if king g7 has to be played to try and push the h pawn, but then comes king to g5, h6, and king to h5, h7, and black is just in the nick of time here. Rook takes g6, king f7, and then rook h6, and it's a draw. So imagine trying to figure all that out with a few seconds left. So the game continued on anyway. King h6 was played, rook takes, king g5, rook to g3, and they swapped off, and it was a completely drawn game. So yeah, that was quite an impressive draw. Hikaru definitely losing in the endgame, but somehow managing to swindle his way to a draw. He somehow manages to do that quite a lot, which is quite impressive, especially with a few seconds left. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this analysis of that brilliant game, and if you did, please do drop a like, comment or subscribe, and stay safe.